Chapter 9. Temper. Philip jerked awake with a scream, throwing his hands up before his face. Poena was at the foot of his bedroll, and she had one hand on his ankle. He glanced around. The tent. He was in the tent at the camp with Joanna and the fairies. It was still dark, the moonlight howling out Poena's face. Her eyes glittered in the night like a cat's. "Oh, good, you are awake," she said, and dropped his foot. "You seem to have been having a nightmare." Philip took a few breaths to slow his heart and nodded. He stumbled to his feet. His ankle was unhurt, with no thorns or marks from the vine. His heart was still racing, though, and he could still hear the echo of Briar Rose's frantic shout. "If I wasn't awake, I am now," he finally said, refocusing on Poena. "What's wrong?" A number of things you could not even begin to comprehend," she said, and straightened to her full height, red hair tumbling around her shoulders like flames. She looked him up and down. "Eris has decided that your knowledge of nature magic is sufficient, and it is time to move on to fire magic." "Fire magic?" he asked excitedly, and rubbed the sleep from his eyes. Poena arched a single brow and exhaled sharply through her nose. "The branch of magic that concerns the summoning, manipulation, and extinguishing of fire." Philip's cheeks warmed. His father had nothing on Poena. "Get dressed and meet me outside," she said. "Unlike Eris, I refuse to coddle you." Philip dressed faster than he ever had before and rinsed his mouth with water, still reeling from how real his expulsion from the dream had felt. He was groggy, and his mind felt fuzzy, as if he were watching the waking world through a veil of fog, and a feeling of guilt was beginning to build inside of him. He and Briar Rose truly got the worst of each other, meeting only when tired and desperate for sleep. Not knowing how much the other had heard was a peculiar sort of nightmare, they knew everything about each other. Except they didn't. He had never known her aunts to forbid her from doing anything, but she was now trapped at their cottage. Much of what he knew about her was built on assumptions. And what if some of those were wrong? He flinched at the sudden remorse rushing through him. She had been so quick to try to help him despite their fight. He had to stop assuming the worst when she was consistently the best of the two of them. He hoped Briar Rose wouldn't worry too much over him after his sudden departure. He blinked. This wasn't a dream. He needed to focus. He could deal with whatever feelings he was having about his behavior toward Briar Rose later. Fire magic is a branch of nature magic, but rarely does one person have an affinity for both, said Poena the moment he joined her. She had lit a fire at the center of camp. "However, even if you do not master it, you must be able to defend against it." Poena gestured toward the low fire. Philip's panic over Maleficent's encroaching curse had abated from a constant flutter in his chest to an occasional shock. When dawn broke, he would have only 14 days left to master magic. "What's Maleficent's specialty?" he asked, stoking the fire and trying to ignore his nerves. Poena eyed him. "Maleficent's abilities are beyond definition or categorization." Of course they were. "Great," muttered Philip. "So what do I do first?" "We will begin with fire manipulation," Poena said. "Watch me." The acrid scent of smoke clogged his throat despite the bright, clean fire, and the flames leapt from the wood to Poena's palms. They curled serpent-like around her fingers and passed over her clothes without scorching them. She held out the fire to him. "Coax it to you," Poena wiggled her fingers. Such vocalizations helped before. Philip reached for the fire. "Hello, handsome. Come here, please." The fire didn't so much as flicker. He spent hours trying to move it and didn't manage a single spark. Poena lost her patience after a while, tired of showing him how it was done, and letting him take breaks to suck on his blistering fingertips when he exhaustedly listed toward the fire. She inhaled sharply when his sleeve smoldered, and he smacked his arm against the ground. Poena left him alone to ask Eris what to do. Though she hadn't admitted to any such thing, Philip went to get a drink as an excuse to eavesdrop. "Do with what we have, and we only have 14 more days," Eris was saying. "You're going easy on him. He'll think the training is a farce." Philip crept a bit closer and tilted his ear into the wind. "Of course I am going easy on him. What else am I supposed to do? Have him stand in it like I used to? Any fire I summon will burn him unless you're willing to protect him magically every hour of every day," Poena hissed. "You concocted this plan, so you figure out what to do." Philip's disappointment tasted like ash. Poena was going easy on him, even though she had claimed she wouldn't. He knew he was a beginner, but he wanted to succeed on his own merits, not because she was pulling her punches. He had been looking forward to learning fire magic, too. Eris sighed. "Fine, give me a moment." Poena huffed. Philip darted back to his seat, and the two fairies returned to the fire together. Eris sat down next to him. "Philip," she said, but she looked at Poena. "Could you try to manipulate the fire one last time?" Philip nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He reached out and wiggled his fingers at the fire. A log cracked and sent up sparks, catching his sleeve on fire. Philip hissed and shook it out. Fire would be exceptionally useful against Barnaby. Eris grabbed his wrist and studied the burn mark on his clothes. "Old Barnaby is the wizard who stole the Sword of Truth from your father. She's a grouch of a person these days, but a rather obsessive gardener. She specializes in nature magic, specifically plants and animation." "Old Barnaby?" The name scratched at Philip's brain. It brought up memories of brown eyes, blue robes with silver moons, and the scent of fresh flowers. "Oh, Barney!" She had introduced herself as Barney when he was a kid, and the nickname had stuck. Joanna emerged from the tent with a yawn. "Barney? What happened to her?" Barney and Philip's father had disagreed on so many things to do with the curse, and he had been so busy training that he'd rarely interacted with her. He shouldn't have been surprised Joanna knew more about her than he did. She probably spent as much time in the library as wizards. Sitting up a step from Philip, Joanna watched the fire flicker and sighed before taking out her book. She balanced her ink pot on one knee and her book on the other. He caught sight of untold stories on the first page, next to a dozen crossed-out lines. "I thought she retired to some seaside cottage with her wife," Joanna asked. Philip nodded. "She did, but I think it was a lighthouse." "She didn't. It was a cover story," said Eris quickly. "She absconded with the sword after a disagreement with Philip's father." "How am I supposed to get the sword from her?" Philip asked. He hadn't realized Barney would be the wizard he would have to steal from. "She's one of the best wizards this side of the world." "Steal it, I would assume." Eris gestured for Philip to return his attention to the fire. "Unfortunately, it appears that you don't have an affinity for fire magic at all. This means we must focus on teaching you to defend against fire magic and how to stop nature magic without it." "Of course," said Philip, trying to hide his disappointment. "How am I going to steal the sword from Barnaby, then?" Eris shook her head. "I must admit that I am not entirely sure. Barnaby's home is well guarded against magical and mundane observation. I will go observe Barnaby and her wife Zora for the next few days, and then we will know what to do." "You're leaving?" Philip's heart dropped to his feet. "Now?" "You have yet to learn how to defend against fire magic. which requires Poana to teach and Frike to heal you when she gets overzealous, Eris said. I'm unnecessary. Philip nodded, a hollow ache in his chest, but he couldn't place the feeling. Eris was the only one who had acknowledged that Philip was doing this for himself, and she was the one who never balked when he didn't grasp something immediately. She had taught him how to cheat at darts using wind magic the night before, and that would be utterly useless in the fight against Maleficent. She'd only done it because she knew he'd like games. Without her, it would all be about the princess again. You have made amazing progress, said Eris, flexing her fingers. But we need the sword and shield so that you will be able to stand against Maleficent. While you're gone, I will have my shadow scout the tomb of Amos, said Frike. Excellent, Eris said. Her form shrank and she drifted into the sky along the wind. I'll return soon. If you know what's good for you, you'll be able to defend yourself against fire magic by then. Poana did not let Philip sleep the next day. They worked through the day and then the night, his exhaustion shifting to a trembling, frantic energy around dawn. She was determined to teach him how to rebuff fire magic if it killed him. Or she just wanted to kill him. It was a toss-up. She had started with motes of flame no bigger than her palm, and lobbed them to him like normal people tossed apples. Instinct had driven Philip to catch a few even after burning himself for the first time. Next came whips of gold fire, hotter than the motes, that seared Philip's skin even when they didn't hit, and she taught him how to predict the flicker of the fire to avoid it. Though the first hour had left his skin charred and pink like a half-cooked supper, he could dodge by the end of it. But he could have learned to do that by her throwing any number of undeadly things at him. During training, Philip thought of the last time he saw Briar Rose, her teasing as they struggled to find their way out of the maze, her confidence that they would solve it, and her terrible aim that Poana definitely didn't share. Thinking about her and their fight filled him with a bittersweet feeling he didn't recognize. His failures at fire magic didn't help. He wouldn't be able to solve the dream maze that way. Keeping his new magic from Briar Rose, he was holding them both back. Joanna helped occasionally, though she mostly sat with Frike and discussed what they already knew about Barnaby. The old wizard loved her garden, lived in a tower by the sea with her wife, who had no magical powers to speak of, and once, possibly, maybe, had used a thief for fertilizer after catching them breaking into her home. But Joanna didn't understand him. She knew him well, but not as well as Briar Rose. Until recently, he hadn't wanted to talk to Briar Rose, but Poana was so merciless and his magic so fickle that his dream world and Briar Rose were the only constants he had left. She might have been prickly and overly talkative, but at least he knew to expect that from her. He didn't really want to talk to Briar Rose about his training and the upheaval of his life, but he likely needed to if he wanted to solve the mystery of the maze. When Philip awoke in the hedge maze after his second day of learning fire magic, he rose on unsteady feet and squinted at the wall. One of the vines waved at him and tried to snatch his ankle. Philip kicked it aside, then wandered a ways down the path to get away from the part of the hedge that had attacked him last dream. His and Briar Rose's fight had been poorly done and unfair to both of them. "Briar Rose?" he called out. She didn't answer. Philip groaned and picked the right-hand path of the maze. Maybe she had been so furious with him and so pleased with his disappearance that she had solved the maze without him. And now he was stuck and she was alone in the silence he had always wanted. No, she had once helped an injured owl no matter how often it pecked at her. If not too kind, she was too prideful to abandon him. Philip winced and kicked a stone out of the path. He hoped her pride wasn't the only reason she would talk to him. Best not to think about how poorly that conversation had gone, and focus on the maze. The markers he had left were still there, but it was a dream, so he wasn't sure how much they even mattered. He focused on listening for Briar Rose. A familiar voice echoed down the right path. She was singing, something he'd heard often enough, though it was clearer here in the maze. When he'd heard her sing in her waking life, the dream muffled and distorted her voice. But even then, her singing had been beautiful. He sighed, lying down in the middle of the maze once he was close enough. The song, something about birds and roses, was almost certainly her own creation. And as tired as he was, it was nice. He had been horribly unfair, hadn't he? Accusing her of lying as he lied to her several times over? "You have a lovely voice," he said. Briar Rose quieted and approached the wall separating them. "Philip, are you all right? What happened to you?" "I got woken up in the real world last time we were here." He crossed his arms behind his head. "It reacted badly with the maze. One of the vines dragged me into the hedges, but when I woke up, it was just someone touching my ankle. Very fun and not scary at all. Anyway, we need to talk." "Do we?" Briar Rose asked. There was a muttering, like she was talking to herself, and then she quieted. He groaned. "Are you really not going to talk to me?" As annoyed as he had been, he didn't want to go back to their old way of dreaming. He liked talking to her. "I just think we don't—" She huffed and trailed off, like he had caught her talking to him when it was against the rules. "Don't have an outlet for our anger in real life and have been taking it out on each other?" he asked. She exhaled loudly through her nose. "Yeah, I feel terrible but don't want to apologize either, so let's skip the deflecting," he said, and grinned when she laughed. "Here's the truth. I think I know what caused the dreams to change." She made a strangled sound, and he groaned. "Say it," said Philip. "I knew it was your fault." Her clothes rustled against the grass. She must have sat down. "Nothing ever happens in my life, so it had to be you. I can't believe you're telling me the truth." He laughed. "I haven't slept much, so blame it on that." "Why haven't you slept? Are you all right?" Even with them angry at each other, she was worried for him. Her concern made him pause, and Philip sighed. "I'm fine. It's related to what I need to tell you," he said, running a hand over his face. "I have magic." "What?" "Yeah, that was my initial response too," said Philip. "I spent the last week learning magic." She hummed. "Is that the important real-life thing you mentioned?" "Oh, well, there's probably going to be a war soon, so I have to do some things," Philip winced. "If I don't learn magic, I might die." "Magic. Some things. Might die," said Briar Rose. "Are you sure that's not your dream world?" "Well, you're not there, which is certainly a dream come true," he said. This wasn't as bad as he thought telling her would be. "I've been training, and it's exhausting. My point is that our dreams changed the night after my magic made itself known." "Made itself known?" she asked. "Did it introduce itself to you?" "By strangling Joanna," he said. Philip explained what had happened with Joanna, meeting the 3 fairies and some of his training. He didn't tell her about Maleficent, but said that he would probably need to fight someone dangerous once he retrieved the armaments, if he could. "People have always depended on me," he said. "Thinking about failing, though, still breaks my heart each time." She took a deep breath, and he could picture her sitting in the grass, chin on her knees, and nose scrunched in concentration. "I didn't know you had a heart." The sound he made was entirely too embarrassing, and she burst into laughter. No one learns anything perfectly in less than a month. I think you're being a touch hard on yourself, she said. What does this even mean for you? You're already a knight. Right. She had no idea he was a prince and bound by even more responsibilities, like protecting a princess from an evil fairy. It means I have more to do, but also might have less to do in the future, said Philip. But it's more complicated than that. I'm a prince, and if I fail my training, my kingdom is doomed. That feels like a big enough reason for our odd dreams to change. The thorns of the wall started to writhe more furiously when he spoke. I couldn't hear the second half of what you said over the vines, she said. I'm sorry, you're in danger, but magic is exciting at least. I said that I'm a prince. You're speaking with His Highness, Prince Philip of Artwine. The maze wall twisted and creaked, drowning out his words completely, and Briar Rose quieted. I just tried to tell you something about myself, he said, and this time the wall must have allowed it, because Briar Rose hummed in response. Curious, she said. I guess it still doesn't want us to know certain things about each other. Clearly. More important and something we could talk about. Magic. I've got it, he said. He hadn't gotten a chance to brag yet. I'm not bad at it either. So you're actually trying to master it? She asked. You, who never wants to try at anything. Philip scowled. Oh, shut up about that. Like you've done everything ever asked of you. She didn't say anything, and he threw one arm over his eyes. All right, so you do everything asked of you. The rest of us can't be perfect. He could feel her eyes rolling. Changing the subject, he asked, Nothing happened with the thorns once I dragged out of the last dream, right? You were fine? I was. Thank you, she said. My aunts did keep asking why I was so concerned, and I finally told them an injured bird got away before I could catch it and help. Ah, I'm your little injured bird now. I have never been so insulted in the entirety of my life, and I travel with a self-proclaimed poet. Philip peeked up at the sky, remembering their last conversation. What did happen? Why weren't you allowed to go to town? Best they dealt with it all now. Briar Rose hesitated, and then quietly said, Nothing new really happened. Contrary to what you believe, I didn't do anything. My aunts just won't let me go to town. They smile and nod and tell me to trust them every time I bring up leaving. It's in my best interest, they keep repeating with no explanation. It's lonely even though they're here with me. Oh, an adult who knows better than you situation. I know that one well, Philip said. Doubly lonely for someone as obsessed with travel and stories as you. It was odd, feeling bad for her. He hadn't picked up on her loneliness when listening to her, and that seemed like an oversight on his part. Listening to her now, it was obvious how alone she felt. They were both surrounded by people who thought they knew what was best for them and dismissed them at every turn. It makes me feel like a child, Briar Rose said, voice rough. She cleared her throat. Don't say anything. I don't want you pitying me. Oh, that's the last emotion I feel for you. Philip sat up and stretched, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. There was silence, save for the thorn wall, and Briar Rose sniffed. Philip could picture her squaring her shoulders and wiping her face. She had always been strong and focused, but a person couldn't be like that all the time. It would wear them down to nothing. Briar Rose, he asked softly enough to not shock her and loud enough to be heard. Do you want to commiserate or do you want a distraction? In the past, he wouldn't have asked. Not that they had been able to talk to each other before, but it felt different these days. Their shared dreams had always been intimate, and they had grown more so since the maze appeared. Despite their bickering and fighting, it was easier to connect the Briar Rose of his childhood dreams to a real person now. She wasn't a dream. She was right there, and she was hurting. Despite their fighting and history, they were all the other had. She inhaled and said, "A distraction, please." "0 petty, and 1 distraction it is then," he said. "Let this ruminate in your mind. I, Philip the Feckless, have to rob a wizard soon." "Oh, I would love to meet a wizard." Briar Rose cleared her throat. "A real one, you know, not you." They were back to normal then. He muffled his laughter with a hand. "I'll make a deal with you. I will tell you all about my very fun, wonderful, magical adventures once I beat you to the end of the maze. At least these stakes didn't involve death." "You're on, little bird," she said, and took off running. "Try not to get kidnapped by a plant this time." No, they weren't back to normal. Their relationship had shifted, twisted by happenstance and the nature of these dreams until they weren't quite friends, but were no longer enemies. They were something new and growing, as changing as the dream would that had introduced them. And that didn't bother Philip as much as it might have once. The noonday sun hung hot and bright overhead. Philip wiped the sweat from his face, the stench of ash and oil clinging to him. Poena stood across the clearing, and her flames clung to her like a cloak. They left shivers in the air, burning away any vines he threw at her. And withstanding any gusts he tried to knock them aside with. "Come now, your highness. I know we are both ready to rest," she said. "We can if you defeat me." But he couldn't touch her. It was now day 6 of fire training. Philip had been working with Poena non-stop the past 3 days, to the point where he hadn't dreamed of Briar Rose once, and he was further from victory than ever. Poena was a terrible fighter, fumbling all manner of weapons and falling to pieces the moment a fist or blade went her way. But getting close to her was impossible. On his first try, he had punched her and gotten scolded so badly it had scarred. And the second day, he hadn't even been able to get near her without his hair catching on fire. She used flames like shields, defending and harming in equal measure. The air around her constantly shimmered with repressed, threatening heat. Fire flourished with wind and plants, and he couldn't control enough dirt to bury her. Every time he tried to sink her, she attacked him until he was too busy to focus. He had to smother the flames. "Rain," he said softly so that Poena couldn't hear, and waved toward the sky. He had summoned storms before, but none strong enough to put out anything greater than a campfire. A storm cloud gathered overhead. Poena glanced up, the flames swirling in her hands flickering. Sleet poured over her, hissing when it touched her skin, and she shook it out of her eyes. A veil of steam separated them, and Philip took a step back. It wasn't what he wanted, but it was fine. No one could light a fire with damp tinder. He used the steam for cover. "Hiding won't beat Maleficent," Joanna called out from her perch near the tents. She was watching, because of course she was, and she wasn't impressed. "Each time you get burned, I'm writing a poem about it and sending a copy to every town we've been through." Philip twisted to glare at her and said, "You wouldn't dare!" Frike applauded as though it were all simply a stage play. "Do not dare look away from me!" Poena's shout startled Philip, and he spun toward her. The snout of a great dragon, scales made of fire and eyes white hot, emerged from the steam. It was made from the flames wreathing Poena and rested over her like a giant mask. A tongue flicked out between wavering teeth. Smoke poured from its mouth. Philip stumbled back, skin blistering. "More!" The storm cloud followed Poena, but the sleet sizzled away before even landing on her. "More?" she said, hand clutching at her chest. Fire covered her hands in the shape of claws. I am not a candle or some silly little campfire. The flames and the power come from inside of me. You will never be able to stop them. Philip frantically summoned a sword of thorns. The air around her was so hot it rippled like water. She grabbed the sword, and it crumbled to ash. Philip stumbled, chest tightening and throat aching. The dragon opened its mouth wide. He threw himself in the other direction and landed hard on his back, unable to speak or breathe or move. Poena glided toward him, her wings unfurling flames. She lifted one foot from the smoking grass and pressed it into his chest. The dragon's tongue licked his cheek. Philip screamed. Pitiful, she said, red curls alight. All those years of training to be a knight, and you can't even touch me without whining. You're a disappointment. He gagged on the burning air. Smoke curled out of her sneering lips like serpents. There was no point. All of it, his knighthood and magic training, was useless. He couldn't do anything to the flames without feeding them, and she had the upper hand so long as her fire raged. Attacking her would be like punching a flaming log to put out a fire. It was impossible. But he didn't punch campfires to put them out. He smothered them. He needed to smother her, not her fire. Hope surged through him. Smother, smother, smother. How could he snuff her and her fire out? He couldn't drop a cup over her, could he? What does snuffing a candle even do? Air, he choked out. Philip reached for her throat. He couldn't touch it, but his magic had to know what he meant. He clenched his fingers as if he were strangling her. Air. A cold burst of wind swept over him. Philip sucked in a deep breath, the black at the corner of his sight receding. Poena grasped at her throat, struggling to breathe, and a wreath of fire vanished in a puff of cinders. She collapsed. Philip rolled to his knees. Do you surrender? He asked. Poena, pale skin turning blue, nodded. I can't wait to hear this poem of yours, said Philip to Joanna as he stood. Neither can I, came a familiar voice from behind him. Well done. Philip turned. Eris stood there, clapping quietly, and she came to stand next to him. Slowly, the air flowed back into the space around Poena. She coughed and crawled to her feet, muttering under her breath. Eris grinned at Philip. Wonderful job, she said. I think you're ready to rob a wizard.